take your seats over. We're going to get started. A very boisterous crowd tonight, but we have 4 speakers. I asked 4 people, hoping 3 would say yes, but all 4 said yes, and that just moved my clip. Anyways, what happened to that? I was negligent in my duties as the co-chair. We have a new logo that we're launching tonight, and so there's some decals up there, some stickers that are available for purchase, I think for $1.
It's upside down.
What's that?
It's upside down.
Right. Like this crazy capitalist world, right? But anyway, you can buy that over at the merch table there. And so I want to begin by acknowledging that we are on stolen land. So we acknowledge that trying to read dim lighting here, that we acknowledge that we come together on the unceded ancestral lands of the Beothuk and the Mi'kmaq of Newfoundland, and that our government continues to lay claim to the lands of the Innu and Inuit in Labrador. So we acknowledge that colonization continues in the destruction of our environment, the genocide of Indigenous peoples, and the violence enacted towards Indigenous families through the residential school and foster care systems, as well as the thousands of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirited across this country. So bringing an end to this violence and recognizing the self-determination of Indigenous nations is absolutely inseparable from our collective fight against social and environmental injustice. For this reason, as an act of solidarity, as I've already mentioned earlier, the proceeds from the cake raffle tonight will be contributed to the frontline fund of the Mi'kmaq fishers in Nova Scotia. So our theme tonight is on a living wage. So as by way of introduction, at $12.15 an hour, Newfoundland and Labrador has the 4th lowest minimum wage of all provinces and territories in Canada, which means not only that 90% of Canadians live in a jurisdiction with a higher minimum wage, but 68% of Canadians, so over 2/3 of Canadians live in a jurisdiction with a significantly higher minimum wage of at least $14.25 an hour. So the Fight for 15 and Fairness in L campaign is calling on our provincial government to increase the minimum wage to $15 an hour as a first step in moving toward a living wage. That $15 minimum wage would not only benefit minimum wage workers, but it would also benefit low-wage workers, which is defined by the province as those earning $15 an hour or less. So in 2019, there were 48,900 low-wage and minimum wage workers in this province, which is 23% of our workforce, so almost 1 in 4 workers would benefit from a $15 minimum wage. So our speakers tonight, we have 4 speakers. Alyse Stuart from Common Front NL. We have Bridget Clarke from the St. John Status of Women Council. We have Joshua Smee from the Food First NL. And we have Kat McLaughlin, or Kat, I think this is going to be So we'll introduce each speaker as they come forward. They're all going to be speaking to a living wage from different perspectives. So our first speaker is Alyse Stuart, who uses pronouns she and her. And she is a feminist and activist originally from New Brunswick, who now calls St. John's home. She graduated from St. FX University with a joint advanced major in Women's Studies and Political Science in 2009, a Bachelor of Education from St. Thomas University in 2010, and a Master of Gender Studies from Memorial University in 2017. Alyse is the chair of Common Front NL, a coalition of labor, social justice student and community organizations, and she has been involved with the 15 in Fairness campaign since its inception through her role with Common Front NL. So she speaks to us tonight about the 15 in Fairness NL campaign. Welcome.
I put my bag under that chair?
No.
Or maybe Sam.
Thanks for lowering that mic. I didn't want to have to do the embarrassment doing that myself. Thank you so much for the Social Justice Co-op for hosting these events, and thank you for having a living wage event. I think it speaks to the movement and how far this movement has come since its inception. So I was around since the beginning, as Mark pointed out, and I just want to do a bit of a trajectory of where we came from, where we want to go, some challenges we've had along the way, and maybe what everybody in this room can do to help us out as we continue to move towards this goal. So in 2015, Common Front NL was, sorry, how to remove my earring piece here. In 2015, Common Front NL was created, and Common Front came together as a way to look at things from a different perspective, recognizing that a lot of work being done, including a lot of work that's being done by folks in this room, was overlapping. You know, we were meeting on these certain areas where we thought, instead of, the unions doing the work and having feminist groups doing the work and the community groups doing the work, what if we found the things that we could do together? So that's where Common Front started. It's certainly changed a lot since then. There's been a lot of iterations from that point. And in 2016, as folks maybe remember or have tried to forget, which I understand, we had one of the worst budgets that this province had seen. It was an austerity budget put by the Liberal government, which was at that time leader, sure he was. So Dwight Ball was in charge of the Liberal Party at that time. I can shade right now. So he was in charge at that time, and a lot of the measures that were put in place were directly targeting those folks that were the most marginalized. So we were hitting, women were being affected by this, marginalized folks. There was cuts across the board, cuts to healthcare, cuts to education. Really anywhere they could find a cut, they did a cut. Even though we know from massive amounts of economic research that austerity budgets do not work, they cost more money, they are bad. A lot of people can agree on those points. However, sometimes in Newfoundland and Labrador, we gotta try things ourselves to see if they're gonna work. It did not. So if folks remember, then in 2016, we had the NL Rising event. So May 1st, thousands of people marched on the Confederation Hill to demand change from the really brand new Liberal government. And it worked to an extent. So the levy was reduced, some of those cuts were delayed. There was, I think, some understanding from government at that time that austerity was not going to work. We'll do austerity light, which is really what we've been in since then, is like a lighter version of those cuts, because there's been no new funding to anything. So certainly there's been no cuts everywhere, but there hasn't been any new funding to those areas. So Common Front realized from this event that there was a lot of really strong folks in this community and strong folks across the province that could see a different way. They could see that it didn't have to be cuts, that there was a way to reinvest in our communities, that there was a way to look at green energy and not focus solely on oil and gas, because we knew that the day was coming where it was, not going to be our most beneficial resource. The day has come, it's here, we're living in it, and we're trying to figure out what that looks like. So from that kind of new thinking, which is not really new, we always think of things that way sometimes, we went across the province. So in 2016, did a cross-province tour and tried to get to like West Coast, Central, Labrador, and Eastern, like the St. John's area. And from those meetings, we just wanted to talk to people about what they wanted, because as you know, with any sort of coalition or any sort of organization, it's really easy to forget when you get so involved in organizing, what is it that people actually need? Because what I need, as Alyse Stuart, who gets a lot of privilege from how I look, from where I come from in the world, all of those things, I can't dictate what it is that other people need. So we went into the communities and talked about what would help. And overwhelmingly what came from those meetings was a living wage. At that time it was more about, I can't afford, I'm working 40 hours a week, why can't I afford to live in this province? I'm working 40 hours a week, why can't I afford childcare? I'm working 60 hours a week, how am I gonna pay for food this week? So we recognized that that was something that we needed to focus on. And so we are celebrating our second year. Hello, yay us. So So actually, it might be today. It's early November is our second year of 15 in Fairness, Newfoundland and Labrador. So that's where we put our energy. It was an attainable goal that we thought we could really kind of put all our resources behind. And it's not enough. Mark's right. It's a step towards a living wage. It's a step towards recognizing that there are lots of different ways that we need to kind of come together as a community to help folks. And a living wage is a piece of that puzzle, but I think it's a really important piece to start everything else. So I know that folks are going to talk about lots of great speakers coming up, talking about students. You know, a lot of students are earning a minimum wage and trying to pay for tuition and trying to pay for all these things. It doesn't make sense. You're never able to get ahead. You're always one step behind. So until we move up, you know, that minimum wage to a living wage, we're just still crawling our way back from these injustices that are put on us by, Mark mentioned it, capitalism. The system is failing. So that is one way that we're doing it. So we're also feeding into a larger national movement. We have 15 in Fairness, Manitoba, BC, Saskatchewan, Ontario, and Nova Scotia. I would say Ontario has been a lot. We've been doing a lot of work with those folks. They were kind of first to the ground. They had the logos. They were ready. They were on the ground before us. And I think what we've learned from that movement is that nothing is ever guaranteed. So in 2017, Ontario got a $15 minimum wage. Dun dun dun, Doug Ford was elected. And that was taken away. So everything that we fight for, it is a swipe of a pen until it's all gone. So it's really awesome to see so many folks in this room that are even talking about a living wage, because 5 years ago, it was not part of the conversation, even 2 years ago. So that's really encouraging to see. In terms of Newfoundland and Labrador, where we're at now with the 1215, not great, obviously, not where we want to be. So the current Liberal government has talked about some measures for poverty reduction, one of those being a $25 a day childcare. Sounds great, sure. So $25 a day childcare for a person that's on minimum wage earning $12.15 would be about 26% of their total income. That's at 40 hours a week. So after the 26%, what's left for food? What's left for housing? In St. John's, the average apartment would take about 60% of your total income as a minimum wage earner. So what we're talking about is that it's not enough. So until you can get to a wage where you can live, which is what a living wage is, we're nowhere near closing these gaps, and we're nowhere near getting closer where we need to be as a province when we're trying to keep young people here. We're trying to get, you know, folks, newcomers to stay here. We're trying to not have the mass exodus that is certainly maybe we're in the midst of. And until you provide people with a living wage so that when they go to work, they are able to live after they leave that workplace, then what are we doing? That's kind of where 15 in Fairness is coming from. And I think that I'm excited to hear from other folks tonight to talk about the different ways that we're looking at this wage issue and how we conquer, given what happened last night and is still unrolling now, a world of untruths. So to us, work is work is work is work. You should not have to work 40 hours a week and still think about where your next meal is coming from. You should not work at Dominion and be on those lines and be using the food bank. Uniform work. So once we accept that truth that work is work is work, and every person that goes to work should be able to live in this province, I think we're going to get somewhere. I'm probably over my done. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Alyse. Our next speaker is Bridget Clarke, who uses the pronouns she and her. She has taken on a new position of advocacy coordinator with the St. John Status of Women's Council after years of frontline outreach work, most recently with the Safe Harbor Outreach Project. With roots in northern Nova Scotia, Bridget has been living and working in St. John's for the past 6 years. Her background includes studying sociology and gender studies and doing feminist community-based work. Harm reduction, decriminalization, and anti-capitalism and intersectional feminism are foundational to Bridget's personal politics, and she speaks to us tonight on the importance of a living wage for women in this province.
notes to keep me on track, because anyone who knows me knows that I could talk about this forever, and I'm not going to do that. So really what I'm here to talk about is to present a gender analysis in terms of a living wage, and also how feminism can and should inform our work towards a living wage. So when we're looking at the gendered impacts of our current minimum wage in Newfoundland and Labrador, it's really quite clear that women are bearing the brunt. Women in Newfoundland and Labrador are doing the most part-time work, the most precarious work, the most underpaid, unpaid, and minimum wage work. Women are also the most likely to have multiple jobs at once, and this is especially true for queer women, for trans women, for Indigenous women, and non-binary folks. And on top of all that, what we're seeing right now, what we're experiencing, is what's now recognized as the she session in a pandemic, which is to say that we're seeing unprecedented hits for women's participation and access to the workforce. But I really want to be clear that when we're thinking about this, all of the kind of things that we're talking about in terms of gender equity in the workforce, these have been going on for long before the pandemic, and certainly there are many things that are exacerbated right now, but I just want to make clear that these realities have been going on for a really long time. Based on the work that we do every day, we know that women are living and working in poverty. We also know that cyclical poverty contributes to increased food insecurity, criminalization, isolation, homelessness, and it directly diminishes options for people who are fleeing violence. We have a research team doing a project called DV at Work, Domestic Violence at Work, and they're doing really groundbreaking work right now, and part of that is in recognizing the impacts of domestic violence in the workforce. And their recent findings show that 93% of workers who are experiencing domestic violence have reported a direct and negative impact on their employment, which is not a surprise to anyone, but that's a really staggering figure. So to put it in really plain terms, poverty is sexist, our workforce is sexist, our minimum wage is also sexist. Big surprise. And I think that in terms of feminist work and gender-based work, we talk a really big game in terms of trauma-informed practice, a trauma-informed approach. We really hear that language a lot, but I don't think we use it enough when we talk about poverty and our minimum wage, because living and working in poverty is traumatic. Trying to support a family on minimum wage can be traumatic, and that's incredibly tough to recover from. I also want to spend a little bit of time talking about informal and survival economies, because as we know, in recent months, these are alive and well, and these are alive and well when we don't have a living wage. So for people who already experience discrimination and barriers to accessing the workforce, and that includes facing poverty wages, people have always fought other options to survive and to make ends meet. And when we're talking about making ends meet, it's the basic stuff like Alyse was talking about. It's paying for rent, paying for food, navigating yourself around the city, maybe paying for childcare, but that seems like a bit of a stretch. And people who have had to seek these kinds of alternative and survival options are most often women, most often single parents, most often people of color, most often queer, trans, and non-binary folks. They're also most often newcomers and immigrants, and people living with disabilities. So when we're thinking about this and the ways that people make ends meet, the non-traditional labor that we're thinking about is really cash jobs, side gigs, often overtime, often doing work in really unsafe condition, and it also means doing work that's criminalized. So something that we learned time and again from sex workers is that sex work is the only industry where women consistently make more money than men. And when we talk about something that's really evident to me is when we're doing the kind of work that we're all doing here and that we're engaged in around a living wage, often people who operate from an end demand approach to sex work or who would identify as sex work abolitionists aren't really engaged in this, and that seems really obvious to me. So when we talk about wanting more options for people outside of work that's considered to be risky or criminalized, we need to make sure that they're being paid a living wage to do that work. And if we're asking people to leave jobs that are criminalized or that are stigmatized, it's unreasonable to expect that with our current minimum wage. The irony is not lost on women that working at a minimum wage is often more dangerous than doing sex work or doing risk that's higher risk for contact in a pandemic. I also want to draw some ties here to our income support, which is a kind of a different form of a survival economy, really. Women we know often find themselves stuck on income support because a minimum wage job, even at full-time hours, often isn't a better option. Our minimum wage doesn't pay workers enough to cover the cost of living, never mind other costs like childcare. And I really just want to make clear that our province is failing when people can't afford to leave income support for a minimum wage job. So I also want to use this opportunity to highlight some words and stories from women who access our programs, because that's really important to me and I think to all of our work. So a few examples, just to name a few. Recently we met a woman who's earning minimum wage, who is also living with a life-threatening illness, and she's currently navigating choosing to buy food or to buy her life-sustaining prescriptions because she can't afford both. Another example is a woman who's living at Marguerite's Place who noticed that minimum wage makes it nearly impossible to live outside of a supportive housing arrangement. So she wants to work, but even at minimum wage with full-time hours, she would not be earning enough to sustain herself outside of a supportive program like Marguerite's Place. We're constantly meeting women who have to make decisions, like Alyse said, between feeding themselves and feeding their children. Every day we hear from women who are trapped in situations of domestic violence, which is directly tied to their financial insecurity. And so it's really, really clear that women in Newfoundland and Labrador especially are being dealt a losing hand through a state-sanctioned poverty wage, a steep gender pay gap, which we know is even wider for women of color, and through precarious and high-risk work, especially during a pandemic. So it's all a bit bleak. I really wanted to leave on a note that maybe is a little more uplifting, because obviously what this all says is that it's inevitably a call for change, right? And there's a lot of things that we can all do, and I think that work belongs to all of us, and things that we can continue to do and learn from each other to uplift the things to move ourselves forward. So one thing that I think is worth noting is that we see that some claims continue to be made about mass unemployment rates and unmanageable financial costs that are said to result from an increase in minimum wage, but we know that recent reputable Canadian research says that these claims just aren't substantial. And I think that in our work towards a living wage, we really must collectively resist those claims because ultimately they're coming from manipulated research that's presented in the best interest of the corporate elite. And so for people, especially in times like this, who continue to toe the really big business line, we need to make it clear that they're not interested in reducing poverty, they're not interested in keeping women and their families safe. And in line with that, I would say we need to continue to call on our provincial government to make evidence-based decision-making. And in line with that, we really need to value people who have experience working on a minimum wage and on supporting their families in poverty, because to date, I would say it's pretty safe to say that the majority of our provincial leadership has not shown that they have any experience working on a minimum wage or supporting a family in poverty. Something that we call on and that we encourage you all to join in our call for is that all socioeconomic policies that reach the provincial level need to go through a really thorough gender-based analysis. And it can't be an afterthought, it can't be a footnote, it needs to be built into the foundation of how we approach our socioeconomic policies. And finally, in line with our great friends at 15 in Fairness, we need to call on Newfoundland and Labrador to adopt a $15 minimum wage in the works towards a living wage for everyone.
Thank you. The next speaker is Joshua Smee, who uses the pronouns he and him. Josh is the CEO of Food First NL, a provincial nonprofit organization that works with communities in Newfoundland and Labrador to ensure everyone has access to affordable, healthy, and culturally appropriate food. Josh has previously worked on provincial scale projects for Choices for Youth and the Community Sector Council NL. He has also served as the chair of the St. John's Farmers Market Cooperative and also the advocacy group Happy City St. John's. So he speaks to us tonight on the importance of a living wage from a food security perspective.
Hey folks, thanks for having me tonight. It's really nice to be up here with three people who I really admire and whose work is already proving really transformational. I think we're at a really special moment in the movement here in the province, and we should recognize that, and that the people in this room are a big part of that. And I'm feeling an energy behind some of this work that I haven't felt in a long time, and that's really exciting. And a lot of people here are the ones who make that energy happen. So you're keeping my batteries charged. I appreciate it. This is an intimidating crowd of people to be on the stage with. So just to say, I'm going to just lay out how this conversation fits into the kind of the food system and into food security in this province. I think there's a couple of ways that it does that we need to be talking about as we talk about a living wage, right? So Mark did a good intro here. I'll say a lot of the work that my organization does is on the production side of food security, right? We do a lot of work to support people growing food, to support people hunting food, to support people harvesting food, to support the production of more and more and better food in this province. And I'll also say that every bit of that work is completely meaningless if no one can afford to eat it, right? And I think we need to be clear that the food security conversation is as much about access as it is about what we have in front of us here. And that access is an economic question, and a living wage is a huge part of what we can do to make that access better for people in this province. And so that's kind of where we come from on this. That's why my organization is really interested in this conversation and really excited for this to go forward. I thought it might be useful to throw down some stats. I got a paper, it's got stats on it. So we're gonna go on a little journey today just into how this all plays out on the ground in this province. We've got some really good research that's come down in the last couple of years mapping out what food security looks like in Newfoundland and Labrador. I'm going to walk you through a little bit of it. Just think about how this all plays out, right? So I'll start, this is going to be like the parade of depressing stats part of the talk, same as Bridget was rocking it, so I'm glad that you prepped that ground. This province has the second highest rate of food insecurity of any Canadian province. We're just shy of 15% of households in Newfoundland and Labrador are food insecure. That's not a good number, and it's a number that's been going up. So we were at one point recognized as a real success story from a poverty reduction standpoint. I think it's fair to say that's not true anymore, and we need to recognize that. And so what does that look like? I think it's also important to recognize we were having a conversation about the lingering aspects of colonialism. So our rate of food insecurity is 15%. In Nunavut, it beats 50%. Okay, so this is a completely different conversation in the north and in Indigenous communities than it is here in St. John's. But we need to recognize that even here in St. John's, in a relatively privileged community, this is really eating into people's lives in a really toxic way. And we actually know something about St. John's itself, which is that this city has the highest rate of food insecurity of any city in this country. So upwards of 1 in 6 households in St. John's are food insecure. That can mean a lot of things, right? That can mean everything from marginal food insecurity, we'd call it, and that's, you know, maybe having some uncertainty, not knowing where your next meal is coming from, all the way up to severe food insecurity, where you're going without meals, where your health is being impacted. But there's no point in separating those categories because people move between them all the time, right? So, you know, what is marginal one week becomes severe the next. It's a state of chaos and unpredictability and danger for so many people in St. John's. I think we need to recognize that that's happening, and for this whole province. We also know that this is a racialized problem. So nationally, food insecurity rates for Black households, just short of 30%. Food insecurity rates for Indigenous households, just short of 30%. Food insecurity rates for white households, 11%. So we need to recognize that this is not something that is distributed equally in Canada, and it is intimately connected to racism and to colonialism and to the economic impacts of those things. And that is just as true in St. John's as in anywhere else, and I think we need to lay that down. I think we also need to think about, and Bridget raised it, and so did Alyse, the gender nature of this problem. So the other place that food insecurity rates get up into the 30% range is for single-parent households, and particularly single-parent households led by women. And that is the crisis point in food insecurity in this community and in every community across Canada. Is not something that we are doing well dealing with. So what would a living wage do here? I think that's a really important question to ask. And I think we know something about this because we know that over half of the households in this province that are food insecure rely on employment income. Food insecurity is not just a problem reserved to folks who are living on income support, although that's also a tragic reality. Over half of food insecure households survive on employment income, and we know that the reason that is because many of these households have folks who are working full-time for a wage that does not provide food security for them and for their families. That's the reality. And so at the most basic level, I always like to think, poverty is a choice, right? We are making a policy choice for this to exist. And part of that policy choice is the wage level that we have set in this province, right? We also know that women, and this has been covered, women are disproportionately represented in lower income and lower wage jobs, and in the jobs that are being impacted by the pandemic. So all those numbers I'm stating, these are all pre-pandemic numbers, right? They're gonna jump, they're gonna double, I almost guarantee it, right? And so this is a gendered problem, it's a racialized problem, and it's one that a living wage won't solve it, but it'll go a hell of a long way towards solving it. And I think it's important, coming at this from food systems perspective, I think the other part of a living wage that really matters is the agency that comes behind it. So I don't want to speculate whether anyone in this room has ever relied on emergency food supports, but it is a profoundly dehumanizing experience for many people, right? To have to walk up to, for example, a food bank for your once-a-month visit, and at some of them you have to prove your income before you'll get your hamper. This whole experience of being supported through what are really crisis times in people's lives is such a stigmatizing journey. And a huge part of the living wage argument to me is that people know what choices they need to make for themselves and for their households, and I don't think we need to be looming into people's lives to dictate that that choice should be canned beans, right? And this is a huge part of the impact a living wage would make is not just on people's food security materially, but on how they feel about their lives, and that matters. I think the other piece that we need to talk about here in the context of the food system is that the food that we're eating is overwhelmingly produced by people who are not being paid a living wage, right? And so there's some tension in this conversation, because we know that if we had a living wage in this country, the price of food would likely go up. And that is something that my organization worries about sometimes. And I'll say a couple of things about that. For one, I'll say that it's still the morally right thing to do to pay people a proper wage for their labor. And if it's going to put the price of food up, then that's a problem that we're going to have to solve along the way. And so there is a conversation to have here. We need to acknowledge that tension, but it's not a reason not to act. There's another good reason to not worry that much about that. I think that's an overblown argument. Even though the food system overwhelmingly employs people in those lower wage brackets, there's some pretty good research done that the impact of raising wages in the food system is not one-to-one. So you raise wages 10% in food workers, you'll see maybe a 0.5% to 2% increase in food prices, right? And I think that's a price we should be willing to pay as a society. It's a price that brings much more justice to our food system. Because right now, that food system is a profoundly unjust place, and it's a place that ties in particular to migrant labor in this country, who are folks who often live in really precarious circumstances, and that exploitation goes far beyond wages. But at least bringing those folks into a place of earning a living wage would also, I think, be a tremendous contribution to justice in this country. And that's the place where the food system is making some of the most toxic impacts it can possibly make on people's lives. So I think we need to flag that. It's where we are really tied into an international conversation and an international set of impacts, right? I think I love my notes here. There we go. I think I also, I need to name it. I have the job title of CEO, I have a team, I have employees, right? And I think there are other people in this room who do, and we also need to be having this conversation amongst ourselves. But how do we get to a living wage in our own shops, right? So it's only, yeah. And I think we need to also be clear that that journey isn't easy for everybody, and it's not one that we necessarily go through overnight. I'm super proud of the fact we actually just pegged our lowest wage bracket to the living wage here in St. John's this year. That's not a luxury that every organization has. It took a lot of work, but I think there's a conversation to have amongst ourselves as organizations who work in this space and how we can model that. We also stole, I'll say, something from some of our colleagues in other provinces of pegging a maximum ratio. So you set your living wage, and then there's also a maximum ratio between the lowest and the highest within your organization. And I think those two things go together to have a powerful impact on how we plan for what our organization is going to be the next year and the year after that, right? That doesn't mean that every one of us can do that tomorrow, but I think every one of us should be thinking about it right now. And I think we can model this. We don't have to always wait for government to mandate it. And it gives us some strength to be advocates in this conversation, to come at from that angle. So, I think just to put our cards on the table, that was not an easy thing to figure out how to do. But so far we've done it. We haven't gone bankrupt yet. Talk to me in a year. But I think we figured it out. And part of what we figured out is we just need to do it, and then figure the rest out after. And I think a lot of it was fear from our side and from our leadership side. And once you get past that, you can make it work. So I'm going to close just by saying I really am inspired by the time that we're in right now. I was saying when I got up here, I'm feeling an energy behind some of these conversations, behind what the 15 in Fairness team is doing, and so many of the other organizations in this room that feels really inspiring. And even in these completely bonkers pandemic times that we're in, to be standing in a room like this and feel it kind of crackle around you is really wonderful. And so thanks to everybody in here for doing everything that you're doing on this, and know that this will make a real difference in so many people's lives. So thanks.
Thank you, Josh. Our fourth speaker, our final speaker, is Kat McLaughlin, who uses pronouns she and her. And she is the Executive Director of Advocacy with MUNSU, and she's also the Women's Representative for the Canadian Federations of Students NL. Kat is completing her honors degree in political science at MUN and is active in the MUN Gender Politics Research Lab. Her research is focused on exploring the intersections between human behavior and the political sphere. Kat is a feminist dedicated to breaking down barriers across campus and in the community through advocacy and solidarity work, and she speaks to us tonight about the impact of our low minimum wage on students and young people in the province.
Hey folks, thank you so much to the Social Justice Co-op and 15 for Fairness for bringing this event together tonight. It's definitely pretty intimidating to get up here with all these organizers. I've had the chance to learn so much from Alyse through her work with the Canadian Federation of Students, and I actually met Josh when he taught me municipal politics last year, so happy to be here. So like I mentioned, my name is Kat McLaughlin. I prefer she, her, or they, them pronouns. So tonight I'm just going to very quickly talk about the impact of minimum wage on students and young people in this province. So I am currently in the midst of finishing my honors thesis at MUN, and graduation is finally looming in my future. But right now I'm currently serving as the Executive Director of Advocacy with the MUN Students Union. So working with students for the past few years has highlighted one main theme for me, and that is that students are really struggling. My job at MUN is essentially to talk to and work with students and help them navigate the hurdles that come up as they're trying to both obtain a degree, but essentially to just stay afloat. I hear a lot of different stories in the run of a week, but so often I see that whatever students are going through, it's very much made heavier by the limits of their financial ability. So it's not going to come to a surprise to anyone that Newfoundland and Labrador has an aging population. We've seen more deaths and births every year since 2012, and that trend is expected to continue and to grow. Although provinces across Canada are seeing these aging populations, the province's population has aged more rapidly than any other over the last 45 years. So these trends are showing a very obvious need for us to both support and retain young people in Newfoundland. However, in 2018, workers under the age of 25 made up over 43% of minimum wage earners. These workers are more often in temporary work, and they're overrepresented in things like retail trade, the food industry, accommodation services. As workers, young people are in precarious positions. They're more likely to be laid off, and they're less likely to be unionized. Many of these young people are either students or they're living at home with their parents. In 2016, more than 1 in 3 young adults between the ages of 20 and 34 are living with at least one parent, and that trend is expected to grow significantly. So our society often kind of defaults to education as a solution to all of our societal issues. So whether it's unemployment, political engagement, crime rates, just fostering a more healthy and caring society, but obtaining a post-secondary education is becoming an increasingly expensive and inaccessible option for young people. Low-wage and precarious work is resulting in students being forced to take on more and more debt to cover the rising costs of education. So average student debt for a graduate with a BA increased from around $20,000 to $28,000 from 2000 to 2015, with the average debt load for masters being about the same in that time frame. So this means that more young people are delaying starting their families, and they're having a harder time being able to make purchases like homes or vehicles. So between the precarious employment and the gig economy, coupled with minimum wages that are far below the living wages in Canada, paying off student loans is harder than it was for graduates in the past. So many borrowers are then having to defer those payments, but the punitive interest charges mean that those with the most need essentially end up paying the most for their education. We clearly know that student debt is also a gender equity issue. The average student debt is higher for women, and the gender wage gap means that women and non-binary folks will, after graduating, earn less than their male coworkers and therefore have less means to pay their debt and then pay more in interest charges. Racialized people in Canada also experience that wage gap. Racialized folks take longer to pay their student debt, and then they pay more in interest as well. So students from marginalized communities are more likely to come from lower income backgrounds. So this really just serves to continue the system of inequality that post-secondary education is built off in the first place, and it's compounding the effects of other forms of oppression. People from lower income backgrounds continue to be underrepresented in our institutions. So in 2014, 79% of 19-year-olds from the top tax bracket were enrolled in post-secondary programs. In the lowest tax bracket, only 47% were. So we also see then for international students, the cost of education is skyrocketing due to differential fees. So at MUN, international students are actually paying over 4.5 times the amount in tuition fees than our domestic students. Yeah. But according to the federal government's own research, immigrants who have previously worked or studied in Canada actually have the easiest time integrating into the Canadian workforce. So differential tuition fees are clearly a barrier, and it's discouraging these talented folks from studying and then eventually settling in Canada. And then on top of that, student parents are also having to deal with a lack of affordable and accessible childcare. On top of the significant difficulties of being a caregiver on top of being a student, the high cost of childcare is driving student parents into greater debt or serving to just be a gatekeeper from entering post-secondary at all. So these factors are all reflecting that young people in Canada are facing rising obstacles to obtaining post-secondary education. And I'm just going to quickly highlight that all of this ties into our ongoing mental health crisis. Over 60% of students in Canada say that they've experienced tremendous stress while doing their degree, and over 40% say that stress has affected their academic performance significantly. We're really seeing these trends at Montsu, especially compounded with the pandemic. We're hearing about mental health concerns, feelings of desperation and loneliness, and so many students are expressing to us right now that there is a huge fear essentially around their financial situation and their ability to maintain an income that allows them to continue to access their academics while having a roof over their head and food on the table. So as these folks have clearly laid out, we need a living wage in Newfoundland. Students are feeling the weight of student debt, precarious employment, and low wages. Students are living paycheck to paycheck, they're working multiple part-time jobs, and they're struggling to carry the burden of student debt. I think a living wage would serve to stabilize employment, alleviate debt, and allow students the ability to actually focus on their education.
Thank you, Kat. I'm just going to actually ask our 4 speakers if they wouldn't mind coming forward. We do have a bit of time for questions, so you might want to come up and ask the question up at the mic, or if you just want to let me know what it is, we can just repeat it from up here, whatever you're comfortable with. So if we can have the 4 speakers come forward. And once they get here, we'll open up to questions.
I have one.
All right, are there any questions?
Me. Okay. So, like, what happens to people that can't work? Like, we're fighting for a living wage, but what about people with disabilities and people in like Indigenous people in super isolated areas where there's just not work available? We're like, my question is, we're like all on board for like those people having a living, like, because like social services isn't equivalent to a living wage either. It's significantly fucked up.
Okay, so the question is about what about people who can't work, or people who are in isolated communities and don't have access to work or whatever, that, what about them when it comes to a living wage and then being able to survive? So I'll open up to whoever wants to take that one up. Don't fight over it.
Thank you for that question. It's a really good one. I think that question really lends well to something that we're all thinking and learning about this come up, especially this week around a basic income. And I know that there's been a lot of critiques around basic income. Yeah, I think it's something that a lot of us are on board for. There's been some really important critiques about how to do that really well. A basic income is not a blanket Band-Aid solution to the issues that you're talking about, certainly. But I think it's a really important opportunity to take really seriously and to do really thoughtfully and to develop it really well with consideration for marginalized people, and of course I would say from a feminist perspective. So I think that that's in part an answer to a question that you're bringing up. But I will say when we're talking about a basic income, we really need to be clear that that doesn't come with austerity budgets, and that it doesn't come tied to, cuts to the social services that so many people still desperately need, because that's just serving people poverty from a different hand. So those are some of my thoughts, but thank you for that important question. I'd welcome anyone else to contribute.
I think Bridget largely covered it. I just would raise, one position of strength that we're coming from, which was that we've suddenly acknowledged in this country that apparently the minimum that anyone should be getting is $2,000 a month. Yep. That's more than twice income support. That's more than twice what anyone on disability earns. Yep. And I think a big part of that is naming that whenever we can, and naming that as the starting point and not the end point here. Because we seem to have achieved some magical consensus that $2,000 a month is the floor, and let's not give that up.
Any other questions? Yes, Meg. So, just, I don't want to assume that everybody heard the question, but when we talk about a living wage, Maggie's bringing up the issue that a living wage could be different things for different people, so how do we calculate that and kind of accommodate for everybody's different circumstances? Okay, so, did I do that right, Maggie? Is that okay?
No, I think, hey, everybody hear me? I'm really loud.
Is everybody good?
So, I was right. Okay. Enough. So, the idea is that you cannot set a living wage because each individual in the province would have a different idea of what living means, which would, I think, take into account lifestyle choices such as higher levels of needs, not $18, $85 or $50. So I'm just wondering if we could talk about that because that is what the current labor minister said yesterday.
I'm just going to say up front that when we talk about a living wage, we're talking about a wage that's tied to the cost of living. I think some people might think what you're talking about with a living wage is like a wanting wage, which is a different thing. But I'm going to turn it over to our speakers.
Probably coming from someone who's like, how much?
Right, so I think that maybe Mark covered part of that about like some of it is a wanting wage. I also think that it's used by governments and by people in power to dissuade from what we're actually fighting for. Generally. So it's really easy to say that, oh, a living wage is because somebody wants to, you know, they want to get a new car, they want to go to a movie. Yeah, people do want to go to a movie. People do want to have disposable income. They do want to be able to take their family out for lunch. These are all things that make it so we're not just surviving, we're trying to thrive in this community. So I think certainly, if I know who said that, where that question came from, you said the labor minister, Jerry. So, we go way back. Yeah, so I think that that's certainly part of it. And so I'll say that in Ontario, a lot of that conversation has been around. A living wage also is dependent upon the area that you're from in terms of geographic location. So in Ontario, Toronto is a hugely different living wage compared to if you're going to Markham or Brampton or areas like that. So that kind of ties to a little bit. You have to recognize the regional realities of a living wage. But I would also always go back to that when we talk about a wanting wage or a living wage or you know, that discourse, it's that we're trying to make sure that people can afford to eat, sleep, have a shelter, and have enough money to live their life in a way that is enjoyable. And people aren't asking for a lot of that time, right? People are asking to be able to be a part of a community, to engage in St. John's. So when we're going to government, a lot of times we'll get pushback about, you know, what's next? $30? And it's like, if that's what it costs to have a good time in St. John's, then that's what it should be, you know? If that's what it costs to be a part of this community, then that's what it should be. So, look forward to talking to Jerry about this after.
Just so people.
Okay. So I just have a question about inflation, because if we get a $15 minimum wage and then the cost of living continues to rise, then $15 is no longer going to be livable if it is, I mean, I think we're saying 15 is the minimum, right? But anyway, so I'm curious about what suggestions or what you're advocating in terms of how to make sure that it continues to be livable once we reach 15.
So the benefit of having to lobby government a lot about these things is that we have those answers. So across the board in Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and these areas, BC, where the minimum wage went up above $15 an hour, there was no impact on the inflation rate. So because we come last sometimes, that's a good thing. We have the jurisdictional knowledge from those other areas that have shown the impact on inflation was negligible. Same thing with the impact on other wages. We get a lot of questions about like, well, if I'm earning $15 an hour now, if it goes up, what happens to me? And we always say that we're trying to close the gap, right? We're trying to move that floor up so that more people are moving out of poverty. So we have a lot of great research on this. It's on our website, 15fairnessnl.ca, and there you will find a lot of our lobby documents, a lot of the research that we've done. We've done some great work with the Status of Women about the impact of the minimum wage on women, so I tell everybody, go there and check out our really hot research.
I might just jump in because I think the other part of this is do we peg the living wage to inflation or to CPI going up? I think that's part of the pitch, but I think this is actually a really important thing to flag, because that's one of the stealth ways you see governments pulling back on living wages, is instituting one or instituting like raises and income support rates, whatever it is, and then slipping out of pegging it to CPI after. And so like that's also something to really watch, is like it's not that living wage is going to drive CPI up, but there is a risk that government will unpeg and that we'll end up with 15, 10 years from now, right? And so that is something like that we need to be super vigilant, because that is one of the ways that this gets cut. We don't want to be at $15 in 2030 or 2035, right? But so that's the other piece of it, I think, that we all need to think about.
Oh my God, a lot of questions. We would be running over. Is that okay with everyone?
We gotta ask the questions. Remind people about the cake.
All these hecklers. I tell you what, I'll take one more question, because we
Take all the questions and they can all answer.
So I saw your hand first there.
Alas.
I was just wondering if some of the speakers could talk about what we lose as a community and as a social body when we have people who aren't able to participate in things beyond just attempting to live on a minimum wage. So I was wondering if you could talk about some of those things. Because, for example, for students, right, the ideal student in some ways is someone who spends their young adult life on campus being able to be engaged, not only in the ideas they're hearing about, but also in potentially making change and learning and growing in that way. But if you're working so many hours to attempt to pay for things, you're not able to do those kinds of things. Same thing goes for anyone with precarious work and multiple jobs. What are we losing?
I think that's a really great question, and I know that there are a lot of different ways to answer that question that I'm sure other people can speak to. But just to bring the feminist killjoy rain cloud back in for a minute. I mean, what we're losing is women's lives and their families. I mean, people who live in poverty, and that's connected to a minimum wage, and of course income support, like we mentioned, are inherently more at risk of experiencing violence and have decreased ability to leave that violence. So in a very succinct way, it's in talking about people's safety in their lives, and that kind of goes above and beyond people's capacity to participate in the workforce and the economy, but that's one answer.
I think that's a great question and a great way to think about what we gain when we gain a living wage. So when we gain a living wage and we move towards, these, I guess, a community where you have time to be a community. So you have time to go to these events, you have time to participate, you have time, that you don't otherwise have if you're working 2-3 jobs in order to just exist and to survive in this province. So as we enter this new pandemic, alternate, whatever we're in right now, we've learned, I think, some things about how to build community and how to strengthen community, and those are lost when people go back to work and have to think about where that next paycheck is coming from. A lot of these connections we've built and these gains that we've made during Snowmageddon, in these times where we realized how close-knit we actually are, they all fall apart when people have to go back to thinking about $12.15 an hour. Okay, how many hours do I have to work for childcare this week? So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I know there's a few more questions, but we have run out of time. But our speakers are around, so you can certainly go up and ask them your questions after this. I want to thank our 4 speakers tonight for bringing their perspective. Really appreciate their time tonight for this. And all of you for coming out tonight. I thank all of you as well. It shows that there are a lot of people who are thinking about the issue of living wage. We will be having our cake raffle draw in about 15 minutes, so if you want to, you still have time to get tickets. And I just want to remind you again that the proceeds from that are going to the Mi'kmaq Frontline Support Fund for the Mi'kmaq Fishers in Nova Scotia. So please, right over there, you see Leah, and you get the tickets. All right, thank you so much, everyone, and thank you again to our speakers.